Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Clayton Axisa and today we're going to go through the new CyberAlt scheme by the NCC, which is operating within the Malta Information Technology Agency, MITA. By way of introduction, I'm Clayton Axisa, I'm a product owner at ICT Solutions, where essentially in a sentence, my role is the intersection between product development, sales, and marketing. And before ICT Solution, I also worked as a consultant in various Big Four firms. And without further ado, we can proceed with the grant scheme. So essentially, as a high level, the grant scheme is where SMEs can receive a non-repayable fund to boost their resilience. So CyberAlt is purely focused on cybersecurity. So a little bit of a context, a background, why was this grant, so why did it start? What's the scope of it? So essentially the NCC, which is the National Coordination Center, has a mission to foster a cybersecurity competence community here locally in Malta. Um, uh, they are in charge of funds essentially as part of their modus operandi, which are essentially funds from the Digital Europe program as well as Horizon Europe. This particular grant is split 50-50 between the Digital Europe program and also national funds. So a little bit of context, as you know, a couple of years ago, unfortunately, we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, the coronavirus, and essentially it really challenged the systems and the modes of working that we used to work with in the past. As a result, due to those pressures, cybersecurity became an integral part of the business operation. Unfortunately, businesses were caught off guard, they weren't prepared, and essentially COVID exposed those vulnerabilities essentially. Adding on top of those pressures, there was remote working, distance learning for educational institutions. So in a nutshell, it was the perfect ground for hackers, for initiatives like fraud, data theft, ransom attacks, hacking, etc., phishing, so on and so forth. So essentially, it it created digitalization barriers. So people found it a bit difficult to do these transitions. At the same time, there were these vulnerabilities, and people needed to continue working as usual. So it was, let's put it this way, an interesting time to be alive. Um, it's essential to note also that this grant is under an umbrella called Deploying the Network of National Coordination Centers with Member States. Simply put, that it wasn't just Malta that felt the pressure, but also companies all over Europe and by extension all over the world, essentially. And a cursory glance at reports, for example, from ENISA, continue to highlight this point and to emphasize the need for more resilience. So, so we know that there's this problem, but what's the solution? And the NCC, together with MITA, came up with the CyberAlt grant scheme, where essentially it's an initiative which will run, applications will run up until the end of this year, the 29th of December 2023 to be correct, or essentially until funds run out. Because as I will explain later, this initiative will be split into 3 lots. Projects need a budget breakdown of at least 20,000 to start. And I'll delve into a bit further as well, how big is the grant, etc. So essentially, I can start off by saying the grant value is set at 60,000 euro. So essentially, it's the maximum that one can apply. And there are several criteria. For example, rate intensity is up to 80% of the total eligible cost, adjusted for depreciation. And as we go through the presentation, there's also a clearer breakdown with regards to training, for example. So you're implementing a solution, and obviously training would be a very important part. And by training, I'm not referring to cyber awareness training, but training to how to use the solution essentially. There's also implementation and so on and so forth. So it's worth to know there's also some criteria with regard to the minimis, which we will cover as well in the exclusions, and it falls under one of the Commission regulations. So essentially, Commission Regulation number 1407 2013. Um, uh, the implementation deadline of the initiatives essentially is up till the 30th of September 2024. So essentially, the process is you can apply, can apply in one of those three different lots where the funds will be available. It is important to note, however, that the project needs to be finalized by the 30th of September 2024. Strategically, for people and companies that fall under the financial sector, this is a very opportune time because there's also the DORA regulation, which is behind our doorstep. Obviously, it would take time as well, and there's an entire roadmap for one to be up to scratch for that regulation. So might as well take it with a bargain, essentially, where you can cover, first of all, you can become resilient, you can be compliant, and also get it at a discounted, essentially, price. So let's move on a bit to what's in scope, what's outside of scope. So the measure funds, five different investment areas that span from threat detection and response all the way to cloud-based platform security. For your visibility at ICT Solutions, we offer these type of services. Essentially, what we do is we bundle them up in managed services. So what's good about it is that you'll have the peace of mind that with one or two managed services, you'll have practically all the five investment areas covered. So for example, if we had to go through them one by one, threat detection and response falls under our managed security services, where essentially, unlike the traditional antivirus, which just prompts you that there is a malicious actor, it is designed in a way that it has a quick response to infiltrate the systems and get an understanding of what's going on, and it helps your teams to tackle the response, the malicious actor, and remove him from your systems there and then. From a vulnerability management point of view, what's good about it is because you'll have a cursory glance of your entire organization. What's good about this is it minimizes the entry points for cyber attacks. So it's very good because you'll have a degree of control, which, as you might know, in today's evolving landscape, it's difficult sometimes to have. And then and at the same time, it also is continually updated to handle new threats. So you'll have something that is updated on the go. As you can imagine, various threats, various attacks evolve, and they are evolving at a very rapid pace. So having the peace of mind that you have a system in place that is on the ball and is able to react to these changing threats, it gives you a level of comfort. Then there's also identity access management. So essentially here at ICT Solutions, we follow the zero trust model, which essentially in layman's terms means that before proceeding before accessing one particular system, users and devices need to be verified. So essentially, the system would trust no one, even people to a certain degree that are within the organization, unless they verify who they are. End-to-end data protection and cloud-based platform security are also two other services that we offer. Essentially, one falls under our managed security and the other one falls under our managed cloud. So, all right. So one might ask Leighton, okay, we have an understanding. The grant emphasizes the importance of cybersecurity for SMEs. And it also offers, by scoping the grant, a certain degree of recommendations as well. But what is within the scope? What is eligible? So essentially, at a very high level, these are the things that are eligible, and they are split into multiple facets. So for example, these are cybersecurity solutions, which basically focuses more on the software side of things. Then there is also a hardware component. Now, for the hardware component, it is very important to note that these need to be components that complement the software side. So if you're buying a piece of hardware, it needs to be something that would essentially aid the enablement of the cybersecurity solution. Same with subscriptions, license fees, and managed services. Now, as I mentioned earlier, so you have the grant, you have the full amount, but it is divided into various sections. For example, the area related to training costs, the amount budgeted in the documentation that you would submit as part of the application, it cannot exceed more than 20% of the total eligible purchase of the project. So for training, if you have a solution and you want either your staff to have visibility and awareness of how to use that solution or certifications in order to be fully qualified to use that solution, and you can not apply more than 20% of the total amount. So if you apply with a 60,000 amount for the sake of the argument, you can only dedicate 20%. Same with regards to implementation costs. So the implementation needs to be a portion of the entire amount. And essentially, in a nutshell, it should not exceed the 30% mark. Not everything is within scope. So essentially, there are some areas which are not within scope. So for example, things like depreciation. If you have a piece of hardware and it depreciates, that's outside of scope. Insurance costs. If, for example, you have shipping related costs, expenses, repair and maintenance, those are all outside of scope. Essentially, the guideline presents them very clearly. So what I would recommend is before you apply, take a good look at what is within and what is outside of the scope. And like that, you'll have the level of comfort that you're applying for the right things at the right time. So when I was structuring this presentation, I thought like, what is the best approach to adopt? And essentially, the way that I wanted to structure it is to answer a lot of the questions that we have been receiving over the past few days and weeks with regards to this particular grant. One of the particular questions that has been raised over and over again is who is eligible to apply? And by extension, who isn't? So essentially, in the table, it gives you a very clear overview of who would be eligible. SMEs can have multiple definitions. In this case, it is split into micro, small, and medium sized. If we had to look at the smaller end to the larger end, the smaller end is a staff of less than 10 people with an annual turnover of less or equal to 2 million. And for the medium size is a headcount of less than 250 with a turnover of less than or equal to 50 million. Exclusions, essentially, they are quite varied. In the document, in the grant document, it is very detailed. Here, I wanted to essentially grab the essence of essentially who is excluded from this particular grant, CyberAlt. So essentially, undertakings that are in collective insolvency proceedings, so essentially in liquidation stages, those that have outstanding recovery orders, and those that do not follow all their obligations, so they are not fully fulfilled. There are also some SMEs in particular sectors which are outside of scope. So they might not be in insolvency, they might have everything running smoothly, but for example, enterprises in agriculture, tobacco, and gambling, those are out of scope and are not eligible to apply for these funds. There's also public entities. So essentially, entities that are under government which are not involved in economic activities cannot apply for the CyberAlt scheme as well. So essentially, the application process, what does it entail? So when it comes to the application process, there are a handful of documents which we'll cover briefly and what they would involve, but there are also a number of considerations, essentially. The first one is that the application needs to be submitted through the portal of the NCC. Essentially, one would need to apply directly there. Um, if I recall correctly, a company can also apply on your behalf, and it needs to be a locally established SME to be eligible to apply. So companies essentially that are based in Malta. Proposals need to be exclusively related to cybersecurity. So the selected applicants will sign a grant agreement, and their obligations will not only be here locally, but also overseas with the European Commission and the ECCC, which is essentially similar to the NCC, but for across the entire Europe. Apart from that, the applications at a very high level should include clear information about the investment details, what is required from an investment point of view, the start and the end date. So as I mentioned earlier, it needs to be fully operational by the 30th of September. The cybersecurity solution that you would be implementing, and the name and size of the company. Size of company is very important with reference to the table that we were showing earlier. So what should I do and how can I proceed? So first of all, you need to take all those three considerations in mind. And then you move on to submit the application, and it would generate a unique identifier, which then you can use to monitor the status of your funds. And like I said before, there needs to be a very clear budget breakdown of between 20,000 euro and 60,000 euro, which is the ceiling and the largest amount where one can apply. And you can receive up to 80% of financing from it. Companies that have benefit from de minimis state aid, unfortunately, there's a limit of 3 years. So if you've benefited from de minimis, you need to take a closer look on whether you would be eligible. I would still take a look, but essentially there's a limit of 3 fiscal years where one would be ineligible to apply for this grant. For example, if you work in a particular sector where you've been hit with COVID, for example, and there were a number of funds given during that time, one would need to take a step back and see whether they can apply, essentially. So another very frequent question that we get is, what documents do I need to submit? So essentially, this is also a very important question, because there's a number of gateway and selection criteria for one to be eligible for these funds. So having the right documentation is crucial for you to have the level of comfort that you would have a high likelihood of receiving the funds. So if we had to go through them very quickly, there's the initial declaration form, which needs to be signed and dated by the authorized representative of the applicant. And there's also one sheet where you need to highlight who is the UBO, the ultimate beneficial owner of the organization. Essentially, in very high level terms, it is the person who owns the entity. So there needs to be a sheet which highlights exactly who is the UBO of that particular enterprise. A number of compliance certificates as well, and also an organigram. An organigram essentially gives the structure of the organization and the high-level view of how different resources are and different responsibilities are scattered throughout the company. A de minimis declaration form, which essentially outlines a breakdown of the de minimis aid applied for and granted to a single undertaking. So as I said before, that's why it is very important to take a step back and see whether you would be eligible, because it's part of the documentation to apply for this grant. Evidence of market testing, that you done your research, you have a good understanding of what solutions are out there and what degree of sophistication and price and time to implement, all these variables that give the evidence that you've done your homework and that you ultimately taken the best approach to ensure resiliency in your company. And NACE code confirmation. This is a code essentially that reflects which particular industry or business operates. It's a number that one would need to confirm exactly and what number it is essentially. Declaration of undertaking in difficulty form. So here you need to you need to declare that essentially the business is operating fully. There are no issues. And again, if we go back to the exclusions where there was the part of the insolvency, it would be reflecting it here that essentially the business is fully operational and there are no problems under the hood, essentially. Evidence of private match financing, which is another form, and this is very important, a Gantt chart or schedule of works. So essentially, when you're either embarking on it on yourself or you're trying to find a partner that you can trust to deliver this for you, it is essential to have a clearly defined Gantt chart or a work breakdown structure, which gives you the comfort that first of all you can implement by September 2024, and you'll avoid the risks. And this is very important because these type of projects can get quite complex. So having a clear Gantt chart with the clear buffers and the clear contingency plans in place would also give you the peace of mind, first of all, that your business will become even more secure, which is very important and ultimately the aim of this initiative, but also that you can deliver within time. There is a small proviso in the grant documentation that NCC could provide an extension, but it is not committal. So my recommendation essentially would be to avoid it altogether and to implement everything on time and obviously on budget. Financial statements. So from point D to point E, these are recommended or not compulsory. So they are on a case-by-case basis. From point A to point C, everyone needs to provide them essentially to NCC and META. Points D and point T, there are certain criteria of who should take them and who shouldn't. So essentially financial statements, which includes accounts, in this case, essentially management accounts from the past 2 years of the applicant and any linked enterprises, and particularly those that have a holding structure and are structured in a way which go beyond the subsidiary, the smaller entity. Declaration by trustee or fiduciary form. Again, it is not compulsory because not all organizations have such a structure, and certificate of registration. From a legal documentation point of view, there's a copy of the MND, the Memorandum and Articles of Association, which essentially highlights the way the company is structured, essentially, and the Declaration of Authorization form. There is also potentially the need for an existing cybersecurity agreement. So essentially, as part of this grant, most implementations would need to be a new implementation that would make the organization more resilient. So it is important, and it might be one of the forms that you would need to apply to give them a good understanding of what cybersecurity systems are in place essentially within the organization. So now we move on towards one of the final slides. Gateway selection criteria, gateway criteria and selection criteria. So essentially another very important question that we received is, okay, we'll apply, and this sounds interesting and it is definitely a fit for us, but what are the criteria that will help us be selected? So essentially there are three in total, split with different markings. So the one which carries the most weight is project excellence. So again, going back to the Gantt chart and work breakdown structure, the NCC and META would need to have a very good level of comfort that the delivery will go smoothly and as planned. So essentially, it entails the implementation of cybersecurity measures, um, a draft of the clarity and coherence. So essentially here is how clear is the scope while you're implementing it? How clear are your propositions of how you're going to tackle it? How clear is the approach? Those sort of things. And the quality of management and control systems. So essentially, this is one of those grants where price is the make or break. Quality here is taken into consideration, which makes a lot of sense. When it comes to cybersecurity, you need to have the peace of mind that essentially the solutions that you have, when they are put to the test, they can deliver. So quality here is super, super important. Then there's impact and sustainability. So first of all, what big of an impact will it do to the cybersecurity posture of the organization, the impact of future growth and economic viability as well, and the contribution to the market. So here, and also as part of the NCC's mission, they are not after siloed approaches where they say, okay, one company is covered and that's enough. They want to build that community feel. And in cybersecurity, it is super important. We've seen time and time again, especially overseas, supply chain attacks and all that, and so on and so forth. So having the level of comfort that the entire market is moving towards resilience is key here for this to be a very big success. And project risk assessment. So essentially, there's 25 marks allotted to it. Impact and sustainability, there are 30. And here you need to give the level of comfort that in every project there are risks, which is acceptable, but the level of comfort that you have a clear plan on how you're going to mitigate those risks in order to have success. So yes, so essentially those are the gateway criteria, and in order to get to increase the chances to get the required funds, we need to have an overall score, a minimum of 50%. So anything less than 50%, unfortunately, will not have the chance to get the grant. Anything above will increase that chance. So next steps. So first of all, I wish you the best of luck when considering applying for this particular grant. If you want, we're literally one QR code away, so feel free to scan the QR code and one of our certified experts can guide you towards successfully increasing the likelihood of getting this fund. Like I said before, we offer a variety of services that both fall within the scope of this initiative, but also outside. The ones that would be interesting for you to look at is managed security and managed cloud, where essentially it encompasses all the five areas of funding. So feel free to scan the QR code. I'll give you a couple of seconds. And if you're interested, one of our experts can guide you and help you build this roadmap towards success. So essentially, that's it from my end. Thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure today speaking about this grant, and it is one of those grants which I feel will help a lot to improve the resiliency of the Maltese community. We've seen headlines time and time again. I mean, everyone is vulnerable, everyone is susceptible to cyber attacks. So having that peace of mind that you have the right technology, you have the right people, and you have the right partners for you to deliver will ultimately increase the likelihood of your success. The operations will continue running smoothly. And again, iterating the point of having a partner, that's what's good about it is the fact that they would let you continue focusing on your operations and essentially having the peace of mind that your organization is safe.